So Mank was good. So most audiences have heard of David Fincher at this point. He's one of those prolific directors of the modern era that mostly everyone has seen at least one film by. I was first introduced to him through Seven and have pretty much loved everything he's done since then. So yeah, I like David Fincher, and I was definitely excited for his most recent outing, Mank. As I said before, this film is really good, and with Netflix's timely end-of-the-year release, I'd say Mank is up for some awards this Oscar season, so long as it can edge out the competition. So going into Mank, I knew very little about the actual subject matter, aside from, of course, seeing Citizen Kane several times. Yeah, that movie's basically mandatory viewing at film school, and at this point I've seen and heard so much about it that I'm kind of a little sick of it at this point. But I can still totally respect it for what it is and what it did for film as a whole. It's one of those things, again, very much like Fincher. Citizen Kane is something that most people who are at least even slightly interested in film have at least heard of. Although something I don't think everyone's heard of is the fact that Citizen Kane had kind of a controversial pre-production phase to it. Basically what happened is Citizen Kane's screenplay, it's largely credited to be Orson Welles' project, despite Herman Mankiewicz, the screenwriter, arguing that he was the sole writer for Citizen Kane from beginning to end. And that's who this film is about. Something I immediately appreciated about this movie was its willingness to make a full case for Herman Mankiewicz. When it comes to biopics, there's usually a tendency to kind of play it safe and work in this middle ground, but that always ends up coming off as a little wishy-washy to me, and the movie ends up saying very little. That's not to say that Mank fully paints Mankiewicz as an angel, because it does not, and I'll get into that a little later, but it was nice that this movie was fully about something. Mank is of course about Herman Mankiewicz, who at a low point in his career is tasked by Orson Welles to write the screenplay for Citizen Kane, with the help of his assigned transcriber, Rita Alexander. This becomes a bit of a rocky process as the film goes along, and that, combined with the not-so-hidden meanings behind the screenplay itself, become the bulk of this movie's conflict. This movie's somewhat of a personal project for David Fincher, with the actual production of it lasting 30 years, and of course the writer of Mank being David Fincher's father, Jack Fincher, who as far as I can tell wasn't actually a professional screenwriter, but he saw a story to tell, and I think it's pretty cool that his son was able to bring his vision to life. This movie was actually supposed to be produced right after Fincher's The Game, with Kevin Spacey and Jodie Foster in the starring roles, and for one reason or another it just ended up not happening and it got stuck in development hell. But I can think of at least one or two reasons that ended up being a good thing. It does kind of make me wonder how much of Jack Fincher's original screenplay survives here, because it's been so long since the idea's conception, but who knows. I can safely say that if you're a fan of classic age Hollywood, you're in for a treat here. The attention to detail, small in-jokes, and the overall look of the film really sells Golden Age Hollywood. Casting choices like Tom Burke as Orson Welles and Amanda Seyfried as Marion Davies, it's just perfect. So good job, casting directors. The sets, costuming, and overall ambitious production design really helped this movie work as a period piece. But I found the tone of the movie to be one of the most effective aspects. Fincher's known to be a stickler for details with such a methodical sense of how he shoots a scene, so that combined with his choice to implement classic film techniques was surprisingly effective. Well, there's of course the film grain and smudges filter that they use, but also like intentional errors like leaving space in a scene for film cartridge changes, but also more primitive camera movements. It all really helps this movie feel like a piece from the era that it's depicting. On the topic of tone, I guess I've seen a lot of people comparing this to Tim Burton's Ed Wood film, which is fair because there's definitely a lot of comparisons to be made between the two. Obviously, the two films focus on very different things and they're their own beasts entirely, but there's some similarities to be drawn from. your washed up protagonist to varying degrees, their qualms with the industry, who are thrown into a world of characters that become progressively frustrated with both of them. And the look of both films aren't exactly alien from each other. Fortunately, for the most part, people don't seem to be using Ed Wood as a pedestal to criticize this film, but something I have seen ridiculed is something that happens with every biopic ever. This film takes creative liberties, of course, as do most biopics, from things as small as like references, one of such being mentioning of films like Frankenstein and The Wolfman in a scene that took place years before even either of those movies were even made, to bigger things such as character interactions that probably or never did happen. But I've always really been bugged by the notion that a movie's like bad or flawed because it's not fully faithful to what it's depicting. It kind of, for me, falls into the same category as book adaptations. If you want the book, go read the book. It just feels like a hollow criticism to me. It always has, but it feels especially unfair here for something like Mank, where there's so little concrete information about the actual source material itself. What Mank actually does is it just fully commits to a side of a story while also providing some possible answers to a long-running Hollywood legend. One of the various reservations regarding the film's storytelling revolves around William Randolph Hearst, the businessman and politician who's basically all but confirmed to be an inspiration for Charles Foster Kane's character in Citizen Kane. And despite what I said earlier, I do find an argument like this to hold a bit more water, because when you're dealing with real people who have families and legacies left behind, it is important to do so delicately. And while this movie definitely backs Mankiewicz's use of Citizen Kane as a platform to bash Hearst, it never really portrays any false information about the man himself. In fact, he doesn't really play a large role in the movie at all. What we're given is his involvement in the process of the screenplay for Citizen Kane, which is true. The one thing that I could probably see being a red flag for people is Mank's use of Marion Davies, who was a mistress of Hearst, which definitely doesn't paint him in the best light, but again, is true. The biggest bits of historical misinformation spread throughout the course of the movie are found within the presumptuous character interactions. One of the greater examples being when Marion Davies meets with Herman Mankiewicz in hopes to persuade him to stop production of Citizen Kane, which maybe didn't happen. Or maybe it did, and that's kind of the thing about Mank. You can't really take a lot of the narrative aspects at face value. I mean, you're not supposed to. It's a lot of speculation. And I guess if I could see another gripe people having about this movie, it'd be found in the movie's timeline not really lining up to real life. Something I mentioned earlier was the Universal monster movies being mentioned despite a lot of those not having come out yet. But stuff like that is there to kind of show what the industry's opinion of pieces of media or events like that were at the time. For example, the Universal monster movies were kind of scoffed at the time of their release. And that's one of this movie's highlights for me, how characters within the Hollywood system reacted to things and events that we now have the benefit of viewing in hindsight. It's an interesting window into the general opinions at the time. There's a great scene where Herman Mankiewicz goes to a party with a bunch of producers, directors, and actors, and he's just horribly outnumbered in political leanings because Hollywood was actually very Republican at the time. And so you just get to hear these characters go on and on about things like Adolf Hitler's rise to power and the state of Germany as a country at the time. And they're so wildly misinformed and underestimating, which was pretty common at the time. But that's really where this movie's writing shines for me. Herman Mankiewicz was highly critical of society and politics, and his borderline cynicism and satirical humor really shines through the script. You get the feeling that Jack and David Fincher really understood Herman Mankiewicz, and the more we learn about his character, the better this movie works for me. And that's what Mank is at its core, a character study. There's a great Save the Cat moment where Mankiewicz's transcriber Rita is about to lose faith in him when one of his housemaids tells her that Herman had recently put a lot of time and effort into liberating refugees from Germany, herself included. So Rita kind of discovers that Herman Mankiewicz isn't quite the lazy schlub that she thought he was. And there's just a lot of great character moments like that in this movie. Everyone feels so fleshed out. The dialogue is so snappy and clever. The lines here are often so, funny. There's a lot of referential humor in here. For example, there's a great moment where Thalberg has a line where he complains about the Marx Brothers grilling hot dogs in his office, which apparently happened, which is great. And just, there's a lot of humor to wring out of this movie. And it's so apparent that Jack Fincher had a great understanding of the language of not only the landscape, but of the movies that came out of the Hollywood system at the time. The structure of Mank itself parallels a lot of 30s and 40s movies as well. There will be character revelations that are built up to by swelling music, and performances that grow in intensity, followed by soft fades to black. The movie moves at a more leisurely pace than your average film these days, and takes a lot of time to develop its cast of characters. I really appreciated how all the main characters had complete arcs, to varying degrees of course, but again, all of their climactic arc top-offs are very pronounced, very similar to how a Golden Age Hollywood film would handle them. In contrast to that, however, this movie does have less of an overall structure than most classic age films, but that's not to say that this choice was unintentional. I mean, the structure's there, it's just not overtly economical in its pacing. So stuff like that mixed with the classic filmmaking techniques and David Fincher's precise camera movements and angles really make for a kind of classical modernist hybrid of a movie, which is not a jab, because this movie never really suffers from an identity crisis. It just has a unique feel to it. I guess if I did have any big complaints, it would mostly be found in there's some real life aspects of this story that don't really get enough screen time that I do think, if were implemented, would have enhanced the overall experience. For example, offhand, there's small bits where Mankiewicz scoffs at the mentioning of the Wizard of Oz film, which of course he was a large uncredited writing contributor to, which that's funny if you have that knowledge. But it would have been interesting to get a little more insight into that. This movie almost focuses too primarily on one time period of history, when I feel like it could have done more with stuff that the movie kind of just glosses over. Overall, I did really like Mank. I think if you enjoy David Fincher's work and the classical age of Hollywood and filmmaking in general, I think this is pretty much mandatory viewing. It's always entertaining, the writing is solid all the way through, and the acting is top-notch. I mean, I didn't really talk much about the performances here, but it's great, stellar all around. It's so fun to watch the actors on screen together because they've got such great chemistry and they feed off of each other and keep up with one another effortlessly. I would say that Gary Oldman and Lily Collins are probably the standouts here, but everyone's fantastic. But those two in particular are just great. So yeah, overall, I really enjoyed Mank. I definitely check it out, and yeah, it's great. So yeah, until next time, guys, stay tuned. I wonder what's streaming.